The pool wasn't just a pool. To Karen, it was a monument, a shimmering turquoise testament to her victory over a life that had tried, repeatedly, to drown her. It was where she'd taught her son, Leo, to swim, his small hands gripping her shoulders, his laughter echoing off the water as he finally kicked free. It was where she'd hosted neighborhood barbecues, the scent of chlorine and grilled hot dogs mingling in the humid summer air, creating a tapestry of memories she clung to like a life raft. So when the first letter from the Homeowners Association arrived, she'd laughed. The crisp, ivory envelope with its embossed Westwood Estates HOA seal felt like a prop from a bad comedy. Unauthorized aquatic structure, it declared in a font that was both sterile and condescending. The violation notice cited Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 7. All permanent backyard structures, including but not limited to sheds, gazebos, and in-ground swimming pools, must receive pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. She'd tossed it onto the granite countertop, next to a bowl of ripening avocados. Pre-approval. As if she needed permission to build a sanctuary in her own backyard. She and Tom had saved for a decade for this house, for this yard, for this pool. Tom was gone now, taken by a heart that had worked too hard for too long, but the pool remained. It was his legacy, her solace. The second letter was less amusing. The fine was $100. Failure to comply. This time, she didn't laugh. She marched down to the HOA's sterile office, a converted model home at the entrance of the subdivision. A woman with a severe blonde bob and a nameplate that read Cynthia greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Karen, so nice of you to finally drop in," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "We were getting worried." "There's been a mistake," Karen stated, slapping the letter onto the polished desk. "My pool was installed 3 years ago. Why is this suddenly an issue now?" Cynthia peered at the letter through her designer glasses. "Oh, there's no mistake. We have a new board member, you see. Mr. Henderson. He's very thorough. He's been conducting a full audit of all properties." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, he's a bit of a stickler for the rules. Found quite a few discrepancies." "Discrepancies?" Karen's voice rose. "It's a swimming pool, Cynthia, not a secret nuclear silo. My son and his friends use it. The whole neighborhood uses it. And that's another thing," Cynthia said, her smile tightening. "The noise complaints. We've had several. Loud music, splashing late into the evening. It's a family community, Karen." The accusation hit her like a splash of icy water. Noise complaints? Her son, Leo, was a good kid. His friends were polite. They were just teenagers enjoying the summer. Who complained? Karen demanded. Was it Janice from next door? Because her poodle won't stop yapping at all hours, and I've never said a word. Cynthia simply shrugged, a delicate, infuriating gesture. All complaints are anonymous, you know that. The rules are the rules. You'll need to submit a retroactive application. And of course, pay the outstanding fines. Karen left the office seething, the injustice of it a hot coal in her stomach. A retroactive application. It was a bureaucratic hoop designed to humiliate her. She drove home, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, and found Leo and his friend, Marcus, in the backyard, cannonballing into the deep end. Their joyous shouts, which usually warmed her heart, now sounded like a ticking clock. She tried to comply. She filled out the mountain of paperwork, a dizzying maze of permits, contractor licenses, and landscape designs. She paid the initial fine, the bitter taste of capitulation in her mouth. She submitted the application and waited. A week later, it was denied. The reason was maddeningly vague. Non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. Aesthetic standards? What did that even mean? The pool was beautiful, a classic kidney shape surrounded by tasteful flagstone pavers and blooming gardenias. The fines began to escalate. $100 became $250, then $500. Each letter was a fresh stab of anxiety. Her savings, already strained since Tom's death, began to dwindle. She started having nightmares of the pool being filled with dirt, her sanctuary turned into a grave. The final notice arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't in an ivory envelope. It was a stark, white document delivered by certified mail, a single, ominous page that felt heavier than a tombstone. It gave her a deadline, 30 days. 30 days to either drain the pool and have it professionally removed or face legal action and a lien on her house. That's when the fight truly began. Karen, a woman who had always believed in playing by the rules, was about to break every single one of them. She wasn't just Fig. The sob tore from Karen's throat, a ragged, ugly sound that left her gasping for air. Defeat was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. She stood there long after Officer Miller had driven off in his golf cart, long after the last of her neighbors had scurried back into their homes, leaving her alone in the twilight. The only thing she could see was the glint of the setting sun on the brass padlock, a grotesque jewel on the chain that bound her sanctuary. It was a declaration of war. She finally stumbled back inside, the house feeling cavernous and cold. The petition papers were still crumpled in her fist. She smoothed them out on the kitchen island, the signatures a testament to a battle fought and lost. She was tracing the looping script of Mrs. Miller's name when the back door slid open. "Mom? What happened?" Leo stood there, his swim trunks still damp, a towel slung over his shoulder. His eyes, so much like Tom's, were wide with confusion. He'd been at Marcus's house, oblivious. He followed her gaze out the window to the locked gate. "No," he whispered, the single word filled with disbelief. He strode to the window, his hand pressing against the glass. "He actually did it? That old jerk actually locked our pool?" "He did," Karen said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside her. "Well, I'll just cut it off," Leo declared, his teenage bravado flaring. "I'll get the bolt cutters from the garage." "No, you won't," Karen said, her voice sharp. "Leo, don't. That's what he wants. He's waiting for us to make a mistake, to give him a reason to call the real cops." She saw the fight in his eyes, the same stubborn fire that had burned in his father. "We have to be smarter than him." The next few days were a quiet, simmering hell. The padlock was a constant, mocking presence. The shimmering blue water of the pool, once a source of joy, now felt like a mirage in a desert of injustice. Karen found herself obsessively watching Henderson's house. She saw him out in his yard, meticulously trimming his hedges, his movements precise and controlled. He never looked her way, but she felt his awareness of her, a cold, calculating pressure. This wasn't just a stickler for the rules. This was personal. But why? They'd barely exchanged a dozen words since he'd moved in 6 months ago. Her first visit was to the Millers. Sarah Miller opened the door, her face etched with sympathy. "Karen, I am so sorry. I can't believe he did that." "I can," Karen said grimly, stepping inside. "Sarah, I need to know more about him. Henderson. What's his story?" Sarah and her husband, Dave, exchanged a look. "He's retired," Dave offered, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Moved here from up north. Kept to himself mostly, until he got himself nominated to the HOA board. No one ran against him." "What did he do before?" Karen pressed. "He was a city building inspector," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "For 30 years. A real hard case, from what I hear. My cousin's a contractor, had a few run-ins with him. Said Henderson was the kind of guy who'd fail an inspection if your paperwork wasn't stapled in the top left corner. He lived for the fine print. A building inspector." It clicked into place. The audit, the obsession with bylaws, the non-compliance with aesthetic standards. It was his language. He was a man who had spent his life wielding power through regulations, and now he'd brought that same petty tyranny to their neighborhood. "There has to be a weakness," Karen mused, more to herself than to them. "Everyone has one." Armed with this new knowledge, Karen spent the next 48 hours doing something she'd never done before. She became a detective. She dug out the thick binder of HOA covenants and bylaws she'd been given at closing and had never read. She sat at her dining room table with a pot of coffee and a highlighter, poring over pages of dense legalese until her eyes burned. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 7 was her enemy, but somewhere in this labyrinth of rules there had to be a friendly ghost. She found it, late on the second night, buried in a section about common areas. Section 8, community amenities. Any property or feature designated by a majority vote of the board as a community amenity shall be made accessible to all residents of Westwood Estates during designated hours. An idea, wild and audacious, began to form. He had used the rules as a weapon against her. She would use them right back. The next morning, she was a woman transformed. The despair was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She spent the day on the phone, calling every neighbor who had signed her petition. She didn't ask for sympathy, she called for a revolution. He locked my pool, she said, her voice calm and firm. But he made it a community issue. He cited noise complaints and community standard. So, let's make it a community amenity. She explained her plan. It was simple, elegant. Karen dropped the bolt cutters as if they were red hot. They landed with a soft thud on the grass, the sound swallowed by the vast, sudden silence. She felt naked, exposed, a bug under a magnifying glass. The blinking red eye of the camera wasn't just watching. It was judging, recording, and condemning. She backed away slowly, her retreat a clumsy, heart-pounding scramble back to the safety of her house. She slid the glass door shut and leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Checkmate. He had anticipated her every move. The flyers, the community event, the inevitable attempt to remove the lock. He'd seen it all coming. She felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't just a stickler for the rules. He was a predator, and she had walked right into his trap. Sleep was impossible. The image of the red light was burned into her mind. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, was Henderson watching. By morning, a new emotion had burned through the fear. Rage. Cold, clear, and focused. He wanted to play chess? Fine. She was done playing his game. It was time to flip the whole board over. The community swim day was less than 8 hours away. The lock was still on the gate. The camera was still watching. Her grand act of defiance was set to be a spectacular failure. She needed a new strategy, and she needed it now. She thought about his power. It wasn't just the bylaws. It was the perception of his authority. It was Cynthia's deferential tone, the neighbors' nervous glances. He had created an aura of untouchable control. To beat him, she had to shatter that illusion. She had to find the crack in his perfectly constructed facade. Her mind went back to the HOA office, to Cynthia. The woman was Henderson's mouthpiece, but was she his disciple? Karen remembered the flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear? Resentment? Cynthia was the gatekeeper of information. And every gatekeeper has a key. Karen put on a simple sundress, something non-threatening. She walked to the HOA office, her steps measured and calm. When she entered, Cynthia looked up from her computer, her professional smile snapping into place, though it faltered slightly when she saw who it was. Karen. To what do we owe the pleasure? Cynthia, good morning, Karen said, her voice breezy and light. I just have a quick procedural question. I was reading the bylaws again. Fascinating stuff, really, and I was curious about board member appointments. I know Mr. Henderson was nominated, but I can't seem to find the minutes from that election meeting. Cynthia's fingers froze over her keyboard. Oh. Well, that's all public record, of course, but it can be a bit complicated to locate. I'm sure, Karen said, leaning casually against the desk. It's just, I was talking to some of the older residents, and they were so fond of George Peterson, the man who held the seat before. It seems a shame he had to step down. At the mention of George's name, a genuine emotion crossed Cynthia's face. a flash of sadness. Yes, it was, she said quietly. Karen pressed gently. They said it was because he took that long RV trip to see his grandkid. Something about a residency clause. Cynthia's eyes darted toward the closed door of the inner office, Henderson's sanctum. She lowered her voice. Look, Karen, I really shouldn't, Cynthia, Karen said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, her eyes locking with the other woman's. This man is trying to take my home. He's filming my backyard. This isn't about a pool, and you know it. Was it a fair vote? Cynthia's composure finally cracked. She let out a long, shaky breath. There was no vote, she admitted, the words tumbling out. George was gone for 92 days. The bylaws state a board member must be a permanent resident. Henderson found the clause. He called an emergency session with the other 2 board members. One was on vacation, Skyping in from Hawaii. He presented his evidence that George had abandoned his post. He nominated himself as the only viable replacement who could step in immediately. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly by the book. The ugly truth settled into place. It wasn't an election, it was a coup. He hadn't earned his power. He'd stolen it, using the very rules he claimed to uphold as his weapon. Thank you, Cynthia, Karen said, her voice filled with a new, dangerous calm. You've been very helpful. She walked out of the office and into the blazing afternoon sun, the plan now crystal clear in her mind. She wasn't just fighting for her pool anymore. She was fighting for George. She was fighting for every neighbor who was too intimidated to speak up. At 2 p.m., the scene in her backyard was a study in tragic comedy. Dozens of neighbors stood awkwardly on the community green space that separated her yard from Henderson's. Kids in brightly colored swimsuits held deflated pool noodles, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. The Millers were tea. The collective gasp from the crowd was sharp and sudden, a vacuum of sound in the humid afternoon air. All eyes swiveled from Karen to the trembling figure of Mrs. Henderson, a woman most of them had only ever seen as a silent shadow tending her rose bushes. Her name was Eleanor, and in that moment she was no longer a shadow. She was a lightning strike. Mr. Henderson appeared in the doorway behind her, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage. Eleanor, get back in the house. Now. His voice was low, but it cracked with a fury that made the neighbors nearest to him flinch. Eleanor didn't even look at him. Her eyes, red-rimmed and blazing, were fixed on the crowd, on Karen. Don't you listen to him, she pleaded, her voice gaining strength. He's a bully. He's always been a bully. She took a staggering step forward onto the lawn, waving the sheaf of papers clutched in her white-knuckled fist. This is from our old HOA. The minutes from the meeting where he had my father removed. My dad, who had a heart condition. The stress of it nearly killed him. Henderson lunged for her, grabbing her arm. That's enough. No. Eleanor shrieked, wrenching her arm free with surprising strength. I've had enough. I've watched you terrorize people my whole life, Robert. First my father, now this woman. She gestured toward Karen. All because you can't stand to see anyone happy. Because you have nothing inside you but rules and bitterness. The papers scattered from her hand, caught by a sudden breeze, and fluttered across the manicured lawn like wounded birds. Dave Miller, without a second's hesitation, moved to gather them. He picked up a page, his eyes scanning it quickly. His face hardened. She's right, he said, his voice booming across the green. It's all here. A motion to remove the president for failing to file a financial disclosure form that wasn't even due for another week. The motion was made by Robert Henderson. A wave of angry muttering swept through the crowd. The illusion of Henderson's authority, so carefully constructed, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He was no longer an imposing figure of order. He was just a petty tyrant, exposed by his own wife. He stood frozen, his face ashen, his eyes darting from his wife to the neighbors, who were now looking at him with open contempt. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost control of them. Karen watched, her heart pounding. This was more than she could have ever hoped for. It was a public reckoning. She walked off her patio and crossed the grass, stopping directly in front of Eleanor Henderson. "Thank you," Karen said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor gave a shaky, tearful nod. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For everything." Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "What in the world is going on here?" It was George Peterson. He stood at the edge of the crowd, having just returned from his daily walk, his face a mask of bewilderment. He'd heard the shouting and come to investigate. Sarah Miller rushed to his side. "George, you need to see this." She explained everything in a torrent of hushed, urgent words, pointing from Henderson to the papers in her husband's hand. As George listened, his kindly face darkened with a slow-burning anger. He was a man respected by everyone. When he finally strode forward, the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked right up to Henderson, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "You," George said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "You used my family, my grandchildren, as a weapon to steal my seat. You did it behind my back." "I followed the bylaws, George," Henderson stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by a weak, reedy defensiveness. "You twisted them," George shot back. "There's a difference between following the law and using it as a club to beat people with. This neighborhood is a community, not your personal fiefdom." He turned to the other two board members, who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd, looking deeply uncomfortable. "We're calling an emergency meeting. Right now. The first order of business will be a vote of no confidence in Mr. Henderson. The second will be to repeal the violation notice against Mrs. Davison." A cheer went up from the crowd. It was a full-blown rebellion. Henderson stood isolated, a king without a kingdom. His wife had left his side and was being comforted by Sarah Miller. His neighbors were openly glaring at him. His power, built on a foundation of fear and fine print, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. Leo, who had been watching from the patio, came to stand beside his mother. "Mom," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "The bolt cutters. They're still on the lawn." Karen looked from the defeated figure of Henderson to the triumphant faces of her neighbors. She saw the kids, still clutching their swim toys, their eyes wide with hope. She looked at the padlock, the ugly brass symbol of. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of joyous chaos. The air, once thick with tension, was now filled with the sounds of splashing, laughter, and the sizzle of burgers on the Miller's grill, which they'd rolled across the street. It was a true community party, forged in the fires of a common enemy. Karen, the reluctant general of this suburban rebellion, found herself hugged by people whose names she barely knew. They saw her as a hero, but all she felt was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Victory was not a clean, simple thing. Amid the celebration, she kept glancing across the green. The Henderson house was silent, all its blinds drawn, a fortress of shame in the late afternoon sun. Robert Henderson had retreated inside after George's proclamation, and no one had seen him since. Eleanor, however, remained. She sat on a bench at the edge of the green space, a solitary figure wrapped in a borrowed cardigan from Sarah Miller, politely declining all offers of food or drink. As dusk began to settle, and the partygoers started to drift back to their own homes, Karen finally walked over to her. She sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "He's packing a bag," Eleanor said finally, her voice raspy. She didn't look at Karen, just stared at the dark windows of her own home. "He's going to his sister's in Florida. He said he can't live here anymore." "I'm sorry," Karen said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh. "Don't be. I'm not. 35 years I've lived like this, watching him suck the joy out of every room he enters. My father, he was a good man. He loved building things, loved being part of a community. Robert saw that as a weakness. He sees everything good as a weakness. She finally turned to Karen, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. What you did today, you have no idea. You didn't just save your pool. You saved me. The raw honesty of the confession struck Karen with the force of a physical blow. She had been so focused on her own battle, her own injustice, that she'd never considered the collateral damage. Eleanor wasn't an enemy, she was another victim, one who had been suffering far longer than Karen had. What will you do now? Karen asked gently. I don't know, Eleanor whispered, pulling the cardigan tighter around herself. I truly don't know. The next few days were a period of uneasy peace. A for sale sign sprouted on the Hendersons' immaculate lawn with shocking speed. The emergency HOA meeting was held, and as promised, Robert Henderson was formally removed from the board, and all fines and violations against Karen were expunged from the record. George Peterson was reinstated by a unanimous vote, and he immediately proposed a new bylaw, the Davison Rule, which created a clear and simple process for retroactive approvals for pre-existing structures. The community was healing, but the scars remained. The security camera on Henderson's property was taken down, but Karen still felt a phantom unease when she was in her backyard. One evening, about a week after the showdown, Karen was skimming leaves from the pool, the water placid and inviting in the twilight. Leo was at a friend's house. The neighborhood was quiet. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she'd been missing for months. The fight was over. She had won. That's when she saw the car. A white sedan with a municipal seal on the door, cruising slowly down their cul-de-sac. It wasn't a police car or a security vehicle. It stopped in front of her house. A man in a polo shirt with a clipboard got out and stood on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning her property. He looked at the house, then his gaze lingered on the backyard, on the pool. Karen's blood ran cold. This felt different. This wasn't the petty tyranny of an HOA. This was official. She walked through her house to the front door, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs again. The man was walking up her driveway. Ma'am? Karen Davison? He asked, his tone polite but firm. Yes. My name is Mark Corrigan. I'm with the City Code Enforcement Office, he said, flipping open a badge. We received an anonymous complaint regarding an unpermitted in-ground swimming pool at this address. Specifically, the complaint alleges potential violations concerning the electrical bonding and the setback from the property line. Karen stared at him, her mind reeling. Unpermitted. Electrical bonding. Setback. These were words from a different language, a language far more serious than community aesthetic standards. This was the language of inspectors, of city ordinances, of real legal power. The HOA battle had been fought with social pressure and bylaws. This was a war on a new front, one where petitions and public shaming meant nothing. An anonymous complaint? She repeated, though she knew, with a sickening certainty, exactly who had made tea.